The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Okay, with 3 o'clock. Order, order. Can we welcome the Shadow Leader of the House to our committee? I think the first time you've appeared before the committee, so we're very grateful. Thank you very much, and congratulations on being in this role, which I have seen from Thursday afternoon. You clearly seem to be enjoying. We're really grateful that you've come to see us and talk about this particular issue, because it is something that's been looked at previously, and obviously a predecessor committee did look at this in the 2005 to 2010 Parliament, when Lord Mandelson and then Andrew Adonis, Lord Adonis, were both members of the House of Lords and Secretaries of State. So we do have some recommendations from previous sessions, but we're grateful to hear your views on this today. And if we could open the question. Well, do you want to say anything before we kick off?
No, just welcome very much you looking into this. Obviously, it's something we've discussed in the Chamber and with the Speaker and at the House Commission. So, really looking forward to you making some good recommendations.
Thank you very much. And we will start with the newest member of the committee, Sam Dixon.
Which I'm delighted to be able to do. So, what is your perspective on the Prime Minister's decision to appoint a Lord to a senior cabinet position?
Well, I think as one of the great offices of state, I think that obviously is quite unprecedented in recent times, that the Foreign Secretary would not be a member of the House of Commons. I think obviously it's happened in not so recent governments that other Secretary of States, and the Chair mentioned Lord Mandelson, Lord Adonis, others that have happened. But I think for one of the great offices of state, it obviously was a big surprise for everybody. But I think it has and it does raise a number of challenges in terms of our democracy and accountability and how the House of Commons works, especially, let's say, there was a big decision of going to war or something that we had to consider, and how that would work with the Foreign Secretary being a member of the House of Lords and not the Commons.
So what do you think the potential risks and challenges would be with Lord Cameron's appointment? Well,
I think accountability to the House of Commons, the members of the House of Commons, and therefore to the public, I think is a real challenge, and that's obviously what you're discussing today. That's not to say that the Lords aren't able to scrutinise very ably. I mean, I wouldn't want to appear before the House of Lords myself particularly, because they really know their stuff and they're able to do that. But I think that's different from coming to the House of Commons with elected members on behalf of their constituents. And I think what's especially disappointing actually is that since David Cameron was appointed, the Foreign and Development Office haven't even been forthcoming in coming to the Commons without being dragged there anyway by urgent questions. So we've not had any statements proactively made in the Commons, I think, for getting on for 5 weeks now, which, given that we've got major conflict and really important developments happening in Israel and Gaza, we've got the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, I just don't think that's sort of good enough. So it's kind of amplified, I think, the risks of that sort of appointment, that somehow that position and that department becomes set aside from the democratic process and becomes aloof.
Thank you. Jack Burton.
Thank you. Just a few questions, firstly following on from that, and obviously recognise that previously there's been Labour Secretaries of State who've been in the Lords as well. Is it your view that the significance of this office, given it's one of the great offices of state, is why there should be further scrutiny for this specific role?
Yeah, I mean, I agreed. I read back over the report that your predecessor committee did in 2009, and I thought the recommendations there for that time were very good ones. I think we've moved on a little in the way in which, for example, Westminster Hall and other things have worked. Grand committees have worked sort of since that time. So I think even then, with Secretaries of State that weren't the great officers of state, there was, I think, a consensus that there should be accountability and scrutiny with the Commons for any. But I think the great officers of state as well. I think it is, how shall we put it? I think it's undesirable, really, for the great officers of state in our democracy to be members of the House of Lords and not members of the House of Commons. But given that we've got one, we'll have to, work out how to best deal with that.
You mentioned there about, very significant issues, such as if we were to go to war. But surely in those sort of circumstances, it would be the norm and expected that the Prime Minister would give statements to the Commons, not the Foreign Secretary. Yeah,
and it may be, but there's not just that one moment of, say, a vote on military action. There would be the run-up to it, the aftermath, the ongoing unfolding situation. And as I say, I mean, even at the moment, we've got the unfolding situation in Israel, Gaza, where we've not heard from the Foreign Secretary in the Commons about that, and we've not even actually proactively heard from the Foreign and Development Office in the House of Commons about that. And I think the perspective that members of the Commons bring to those kind of debates is different from the perspective of the House of Lords, where, as I say, I think they're very able to give that kind of scrutiny, accountability, but they tend to come from a perspective of their own expertise, their own experience. We come from the perspective of what we're hearing from our constituents. And when you take the Israel-Gaza situation, where many of us have received hundreds and thousands of emails about that, attended meetings with our constituents, we're bringing a very different perspective to that foreign affairs issue than you would see in the House of Lords, I think.
Current mechanism for scrutinising a Secretary of State who's in the Lords for the Commons would be through select committees. So how frequently do you think Lord Cameron should attend those select committee hearings?
Well, I personally don't think that select committees on their own are sufficient in this case, or in these cases. I do, as I say, I think looking at the report that your predecessor committee looked at in 2009, I think we need far more frequent accountability and scrutiny there that is open to all members. So I would welcome something more like questioning in the Westminster Hall or in a Grand Committee for statements, urgent questions, oral questions, that type of thing.
You're saying if there was a requirement, for example, for him to attend the Foreign Affairs Select Committee every month, that would not be sufficient?
I don't think so, because that's only a small number of colleagues who can attend that. I think he should be frequently attending the Select Committee. I mean, there's obviously, I think, a couple of Select Committees to which he would be accountable. So I would like to see regular attendance at that. I think that's a different type of scrutiny. It's a different type of occasion, what we're doing now, to how that works in the normal run of things for usual statements or urgent questions or departmental questions which are open to all members.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. And I think just thinking back just made me think about when we have had votes on military action, the debate has usually been opened by the Prime Minister but actually closed by the Foreign Secretary. And clearly that is a difficult situation if the Foreign Secretary is not able to come to the dispatch box and close debates. But Chris Elmore.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just to expand slightly, it's quite clear, obviously, you think there should be more scrutiny than just select committees. The one particular I'm curious about is in relation to statements and legislation. Clearly, the Foreign Office, Development Office don't do much legislation, but there have been, over the last 4 or 5 years, quite significant bits of legislation led by the Foreign Office, particularly related to Ukraine and the amendments that, which I can never say the first name of, the surname of, that went through, that was led by the department. So I'm curious about legislation and how you think members of the Commons can scrutinise that when it's led by the FCDO if it isn't the Foreign Secretary. And then in particular debates. So you've mentioned several times the different perspective that we would give as members of the Commons about constituents' views, where the Lords often come with expert opinion, which is crucial in scrutiny, but completely different from what a member of the public's opinion may be, and fundamentally we're the elected House. So it's just to expand really on the practical element of how you think that could work. I suppose one of my queries is that Westminster Hall seems the obvious choice, but there are only 40-something seats, so I'm curious to know how that would work logistically, and if we were to go down a legislative or debate route, does it limit scrutiny in the broader sense?
If I can just add to that as well about Westminster Hall, when we took advice from the clerks in private, but they did raise the concerns around security at Westminster Hall and whether, because of its geographical location, it could ever be sufficiently secure.
I mean, that's probably a whole other sort of issue, really. I mean, everywhere on the estate should be, in my view, and if it's not, then we've sort of got a problem. I mean, look, I think my starting point, I think the view of my side of the House, if you like, would be that these kind of positions and this kind of conversation that we're having should mean that we end up with maximum scrutiny and accountability, but with minimal sort of pomp and ceremony and occasion. And I think, you know, I know there's been debates about coming to the bar of the House and that kind of thing. I think that provides, you know, lots of occasion and attention and everything else, but maybe not the sort of scrutiny or what we're looking for here. So I think Westminster Hall is obviously one option. I think setting up a grand committee that could take place in Committee Room 14 or one of the big committee rooms is an alternative, and obviously we've got precedent for that as well. We've got grand committees of the House of Commons. I think we could house more people in Committee Room 14, and it's set up to do that. It could do that. Some of the other bigger committee rooms potentially could do that, and obviously where it's for members on the order paper, for example, maybe Westminster Hall is more appropriate there, because you kind of largely know the sort of numbers for that. But for big important statements, yeah, I think we'd have to use one of the larger committee rooms and have it as a grand committee. It would be my preference and our preference, I think, rather than standing at the bar of the House, which I think is not the optimal option.
Okay.
Follow on from that.
Yes, of course, Sam.
And what about the proposal to stand at the dispatch box?
I don't think we should break precedent to that degree, no. I mean, I think, you know, that they're for the elected members of the House of Commons, and I don't think we should use the dispatch box like that. I think that would be our view. And I think as you asked at the beginning, I mean, I think this is why it is not very desirable and it is suboptimal in the first place, that we've got such an important office of state at such an important time for that office of state being given to somebody who's not a member of the Commons. And I think we should have some disquiet about that as the House of Commons.
Lucy, I share your concerns that the decision which was taken to appoint a Foreign Secretary as a member of the House of Lords, would you agree that one way to overcome this would be to put into our standing orders a prohibition on any of the key Secretaries of State being able to be members of the other House, and they would have to be members of this House in the same way as the Prime Minister has to be a member of this House? And then that would remove the scope or the temptation for Prime Ministers to appoint somebody to the very top positions as a member in the House of Lords. That would then overcome the problems at a stroke, instead of us having to try and get round that. Obviously, at this instant, we've got to try and find short-term ways of getting around it, but wouldn't a longer-term solution be to have an absolute prohibition on these key positions being held by members of the other place?
You think the great offices of state? Yeah, I mean, I think with the great offices of state, I would concur. I haven't looked at the standing order issue, and I mean that might be something for you to consider. But I mean, I think Prime Ministers should feel that they shouldn't need to do that, in my opinion, for the great offices of state anyway. There might be time for other Secretaries of State because of particular expertise and so on, as we've had in the past.
There always used to be, the Lord Chancellor always used to be, as a key player, he used to be in
Yeah, we've managed that okay. We've managed that okay in the past.
Thank you. Actually, it's okay. I kind of wanted to build on the question that Sir Christopher's just asked. Do you think there's risk isn't necessarily the right word, but do you think that this might set some sort of precedent, especially if we find a solution or a new way of working, that it might encourage future Prime Ministers to appoint more cabinet ministers, whether they're great offices of state or any other cabinet secretaries? Do you think there's any advantages or disadvantages or possible precedents that future Prime Ministers might feel now more at liberty to appoint cabinet secretaries and then put them in the House of Lords from outside of the House of Commons, essentially? Well,
I mean, I would hope that any recommendations you make don't then offer as a sort of incentive. I'm sure they wouldn't, and I'm sure you will kind of couch that in terms that that whatever you recommend is suboptimal. because it is suboptimal. And I think ultimately these things come down to political pressure, don't they, on the Prime Minister of the day. And perhaps if there wasn't a general election now kind of around the corner and this was a fairly short-term issue, touch wood on my side anyway, but who knows, but that there might have been a bigger build-up of political pressure there about this. But yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. You don't want to kind of come to an accommodation such that then future Prime Ministers think, oh, well, it's great, the House of Commons can now scrutinise them. Because I just don't think anything that we can come up with would really do the job, especially if there was some, bigger escalation, if there was some kind of big decision on military action. I think that would fall flat sort of fairly quickly, really.
I mean, I think there are, because I think there is maybe a slightly wider issue that we can explore, because there are a number of ministers in the Lords. There are already ministers in the Lords, obviously, for each department. Some of them have quite specific briefs. I think sometimes members find it quite frustrating when members of the House of Commons find it quite frustrating when the particular area of a brief that they're interested in, either departmental questions or perhaps more often in a Westminster Hall debate, and it's not the responsible minister able to answer because that minister is in the Lords. And I wonder if either, where we're going with this work might find a resolution to that, or whether there maybe needs to be some sort of accommodation at government level so that members and ministers responding and members who are asking questions in the Commons can feel more empowered to speak on the specific briefs that members of the Commons are interested in. I don't know if you've got any perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, personally speaking, I think that junior ministers in any department should be able to speak across and should be across the issues in that department and should be able to do Westminster Hall debates or answer all questions or urgent questions in the Commons on behalf of their whole department, really. Now, maybe we've not had ministers who are sufficiently up to speed, but they should be able to do that. I think that's quite different from the sort of top dog in the department in a big, great office of state, when there are these big issues happening, with members of the House of Commons not feeling able that they can hold them to account and bring their questions to them on behalf of their constituents. And I just want to make the point again that I think members of the House of Lords are tough questioners and can provide, a tough job of scrutiny. It's no reflection on them and their ability to do that. It's very important for the House of Commons to be able to do that.
Thank you. That's really helpful. It actually leads to my final question, because the leader of the Lords, Lord True, has said that he anticipates that when statements are of sufficient import, that they should be made by the Foreign Secretary, then they should be made in the Lords first and then repeated in the Commons, which is a sort of reverse of the normal situation where a statement is made in the Commons and then repeated in the Lords. Do you have any concerns or reflections about that members of the Lords would receive and scrutinise important statements before we do in the Commons? And both on a principle level and on a practical level, because there could be a time gap depending on the sittings of the House, the other business of the House, and does our business have to be interrupted, or how could that be managed practically as well as in principle?
Yeah, well, obviously this committee is going to have to navigate some of it, because your remit's for the House of Commons and not for the House of Lords, and navigate that carefully. I mean, if we can come to an appropriate accommodation for the Foreign Secretary to come to a Grand Committee or to Westminster or to the House of Commons in some form to give a statement, then I think they should be giving that statement to the House of Commons first, both because the House of Commons is the supreme chamber, is the directly elected chamber, and, as you say, from a pure sort of logistical time point of view as well, we sit earlier. But that's a sort of second order thing, but obviously that's something we'll have to navigate carefully with members over in the House of Lords, because we're not able to tell them what to do.
Thank you. Did you want to come in? No, okay. I thank you very much for the answers to that. That's been very, very helpful and certainly answers the question we have that. I know that you were warned we may ask about precautionary exclusion, because I think you are a member of the Commission.
Yes.
So we've received the letter from the Speaker, and we had obviously written to the Speaker in June this year with our concerns about the original proposal. Many of those concerns have been dealt with through the revised proposal, but we still have concerns from our meeting we've just had, which I can't go through what we discussed because it was a private meeting, but we're curious to hear how you came to the conclusions you did as a Commission as to the point at which precautionary exclusion could be applied, the proxy votes, and also the makeup of the membership of the panel that would determine precautionary exclusion was being applied.
Yeah, sure. Obviously with the caveat that I came in on this sort of halfway through, so I was appointed in September, so quite a lot of this work and the debate in the House and so on had happened before I was appointed. And again, I think with all these things, I think it's always worth putting them in context. You know, this policy is not going to kind of catch all circumstances or catch all situations at all. In fact, it probably would have only affected 2 or 3 members of the House of Commons in the last few years. But I think everybody felt it was an important signal to send, and that it was important that at the very sort of most serious cases, that there was a policy in place that then might trickle down across all the various other policies that exist, voluntary and otherwise, that exist across the House. So the decision to trigger this process on arrest had come from advice from the police. That advice and those conversations happened before my appointment, but I took them as read. I think the decision around the panel was obviously, taking on board what a lot of colleagues had said, to make sure that there was some opportunity for members to put their own point of view across, for that panel to consider other aspects, like, for example, was the member in question already volunteering to stay off the estate and so on, to consider those issues. It was originally conceived that the panel would be the 2 deputy speakers, but we felt that adding a 3rd member on, a lay member from the House of Commons Commission, would just stop there being a problem if those 2 members disagreed, for example, or whatever. 3 is just a better number for these kind of things. And I think we all felt very strongly about the proxy vote situation, that what we've seen recently, especially because some of these investigations take a long time, and there's a lot of concern, I think, across the House, not just about police investigations, but particularly some of the party investigations. IGCS is now actually much faster and speedier, and it is more anonymised, but some of the party processes can take a very long time. That where a member was being subject to a risk-based exclusion from the estate, they should qualify for a proxy, so that there wasn't this concern that they weren't able to represent their constituents while that was happening. And that's why we discussed the Speaker writing to this committee to see if, because there's this whole sort of network of other risk-based exclusions, primarily in a voluntary form, via the whips on all sides of the House, that whether you would consider extending that proxy vote to those voluntary arrangements as well, so that there was equality there. And actually that's where we've seen some of the issues of late, is members who are under investigation by their own party for very serious violent or sexual allegations that are not with the police, who feel after, I understand that, who might feel after a few months of being off the estate that they've not been able to cast a vote. And so we thought that it would be fairer to think about a proxy vote for them under certain circumstances as well.
Thank you. Jack.
Thank you, Chair. Why do you think it's appropriate that people who've potentially committed very serious offences are put in the same boat as people who are pregnant or on paternity leave or very seriously ill when it comes to proxy votes?
Well, because they're obviously at that stage, they're not guilty, they're under investigation. Often from the voluntary point of view, they're under investigation not by the police. So there are safeguarding issues as to why you wouldn't want them on the estate, because they have got allegations against them of a serious nature, and so when those allegations are around, you wouldn't necessarily want people on the estate, but they've not yet had those allegations found against them, and so in that period, only that period, it's obviously not once they've had those allegations found against them. In that period, in order for us to maintain safety and safeguarding on the estate, to allow a proxy vote for those people, because otherwise there's no way of actually keeping them necessarily off the estate. If they want to come on the estate and vote, they can.
Are you not concerned that because there isn't anything to distinguish from those who are off for paternity, maternity, or are seriously ill, that there might not be some pretty serious questions from the media and others about why somebody is on a proxy vote?
Well, I think we've had questions the other way, which is like, why are people who are under investigation and have allegations against them, why are they allowed onto the estate to vote alongside some of the same people who've made allegations against them, who are then themselves raising those safeguarding issues on behalf of themselves or other people who work on the estate? So we have a responsibility to everybody who is on the estate, whether they be members or staff, to keep them safe and to provide these sort of safeguarding measures. And at the moment, there is no real incentive for that to happen. So we've had a lot of questions asked the other way at the moment. So I think
you can understand the concern of grouping all of these people together who are off for very genuine but different reasons in terms of that proxy voting issue.
I mean, it's not grouping them together because they would be a proxy for a different reason.
There's no way of distinguishing.
Well, yeah, they wouldn't, but it would hopefully keep them off the estate and therefore help to other people who are working on the estate to feel they're able to go about their business, go about voting themselves, or go about as a member of staff around the estate as well. I mean, it is a challenge. I'm not saying there's an easy answer to it.
But in practice, what you've just described would destroy the anonymity of the person against whom an accusation may have been made and has not been proved or established. And the paragraph in the Speaker's letter which says that anonymity may have already been removed by practice, that doesn't apply in all cases, because we know that there are cases where the police are carrying out investigations and nobody knows the people in respect of whom those investigations are being carried out. So the paragraph in the Speaker's letter about anonymity, it seems to me is rather weak and not a complete answer to the concerns which are being expressed. And surely, as a matter of principle, everybody is innocent until proved guilty. Once they are arrested, then it's possible that bail conditions can be imposed which will protect those people who need to be protected. That's the standard process. And isn't that better left to the courts rather than to officialdom within this place?
I think we're talking about two different things here. So the exclusions policy, that proposal that's going to go before the House in the new year, which talks about on arrest for a serious violent or sexual allegation, which we're proposing that those people would then go through a risk-based exclusions process. I think the police wouldn't necessarily feel able to put such bail restrictions and so on. This is about the House of Commons and the authorities here and all of us being able to protect everybody who works on the estate. And I mean, as I say, we're talking about a tiny number, I think 3 or 4 members that this would have applied to in this parliamentary session. That's quite a small number. The arrest of an MP isn't something that normally results in anonymity of that member. I very rarely would know that would be the case, that would be a matter of the public domain almost straight away. On the other aspect of it, in terms of extending proxies to those that are on a kind of voluntary arrangement to stay away from the parliamentary estate because of allegations, again, where that's with, say, the IGCS and it is anonymised, we perhaps wouldn't know about that, and that wouldn't be an issue, and so therefore that person wouldn't be applying for a proxy or wouldn't qualify for one. But on the whole, what happens is, where it's especially you're losing the whip from one of the political parties, that becomes in the public domain straight away. So these are generally cases that are in the public domain because they are people who've lost the whip or under investigation, and that's known about. Through IGCS, it is a much more anonymised process, absolutely. And this is a problem we have now, and it's something that we'll have to consider, I think, going forward, is that we have really 3 different processes that complaints are taken through. We have the people can go to the police. That brings with it a whole other process and set of sanctions and points where that may or may not come into the public domain. We have the IGCS process, which I think has really improved significantly over the last few months since it was set up. It's now very speedy. It generally is very anonymised. The sanctions can be very severe, as we saw with Peterbone and the outcome of that. And then we have making complaints to political parties, and they have their own internal complaints procedures that often result, certainly on the Labour side, that will almost certainly result in someone losing the whip quite early on in that process. That's not consistent across their piece. Some of those processes take a long time and have varying outcomes. So I think going forward, we will need to look at this in the round and actually say, is it now that we should actually have a clearer set of signposting for a complainant about where to go when it is a complaint of a serious violent or sexual nature or bullying nature against a member of Parliament? Should they primarily go to IGCS in the first instance, who would perhaps refer the most serious cases to the police? And I think that would clear up some of these anomalies. And I think what the Speaker his letter to you was asking was just about the anomalous situation where, should the House agree the policy in the new year, that somebody who has been arrested for a serious violent or sexual misdemeanour could be eligible for a proxy, but somebody who has a similar allegation against them that's not with the police, who has voluntarily said, OK, I'll stay off the estate, I can understand that is a challenge for the estate, but they are not eligible for proxy. And I think it's just trying to iron out that anomaly. But yeah, we could probably have 2 hours on the complaint processes of all the different ways in which someone can now make a complaint, and those that are better or worse than others.
Can I take it from your answer that you're in favour of having something much more precise and definitive than what we've got at the moment, or what is proposed in this letter from the Speaker? Not least because we may, in the next Parliament, find that one member, whether they can vote for the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, that may make a difference in the outcome of actual votes. And so we can't rely upon practice as to whether or not a political party chooses to not to take the whip away from somebody. I don't see a political party wanting to take the whip away from somebody if they're going to lose their majority by so doing.
So, but I think what we're talking about is somebody who's voluntarily said, I will stay off the estate because I can understand that it's a safeguarding issue, being eligible for a proxy. Obviously, that person is voluntarily taking themselves off the estate. If they want to come in and vote, let's say they don't have a proxy, if they want to come in and vote, or if they're needed for a vote, I mean, Peterbone was voting last week on Rwanda, for example, wasn't he? He was back from his suspension and he was voting, as he's perfectly entitled to do, whether he's got the whip or not. So people can come in and vote, and would come in and vote, and do come in and vote, even though there's a safeguarding issue which they themselves recognise, but they are frustrated because they find themselves between a rock and a hard place, which is an extended period of investigation, an extended period of being off the estate, that they don't want that to turn into the issue as to why they're not being effective as a member of Parliament, if you see what I mean. So it's quite a small, narrow issue that the Speaker was asking you to look at, I think. So if people want to vote, they can vote if they're voluntarily keeping themselves off the estate. But we're just trying to encourage them to stay off the estate for safeguarding reasons by allowing them to have a proxy. Have I explained that or not?
I mean, clear understanding that you joined the Commission in September, before you weren't privy to the conversations that had gone before, and actually understanding the argument around the idea that this is about someone saying, yes, you must be off the estate, the proxy is a way of allowing your vote to continue, but you're off the estate for safeguarding reasons to protect possibly a victim, or just more broadly the thousands of people that work and access the estate every single day. And I'm not really sure how you answer this, but I'll pose it anyway. What about constituency offices? What about the fact that if a member, and admittedly it is a very small number of members, but it does seem to be becoming an annual event, if you will, of a member being suspended or arrested or whatever it might be for whatever the action may be, but on the particular points from serious sexual assault or worse, is that some of the laws in this country are extremely archaic for the protection of members. Privilege, for example, which I think everyone would agree with because it allows us to sort of speak freely for our constituents. But there's very limited legislation around ensuring that our function is to represent our constituents. So why is it a safeguarding issue to not come on the estate, but it's fine to carry on holding advice surgeries, to carry on going into schools, when lots of other professions, if you were arrested and charged on those terms, you wouldn't be allowed to enter an awful lot of public buildings, libraries, schools, hospitals. If you were a lawyer, you'd be temporarily suspended from your licence, for example. So again, because I understand this is all predates your work as shadow leader, I'm just curious if you have a view on that and what the next step is within the Commission of how safeguarding actually goes way beyond the corridors of this building and looks at how we support neighbouring constituencies, or whether other members need to support in, like when there's a by-election. Obviously Sir David Amos and Joe Cox's deaths come to mind where neighbouring MPs step in. But isn't there a broader safeguarding point if it's about protecting people on the estate, particularly where most of us in our surgeries will see very, very vulnerable people on a weekly, monthly basis?
No, I mean, you make a really good point, and I think in the few meetings that I've attended of the Commission and other meetings that we've held about this issue in the last 3 months, you know, that's been at the heart of those conversations, and what we can affect and how we can affect it and what's the best way to affect it. And, you know, it is a much bigger issue than the proposal that the House has agreed and come up with, recognising that affects that would have affected a very small number of MPs, a very small number of situations over the last few years, and hopefully, you know, an even smaller number going forward. But that it was important to do that at least at first, because then that would send a very sort of clear signal, and it was the thing that we could affect, and we could affect most quickly. But the trade unions who represent the staff who work on the estate raise with us every month about broader safeguarding issues around constituency offices and elsewhere. I think the exclusions policy would apply to constituency offices, but I think your broader point is well made, which is, you know, there's still lots of other places you can go.
What next? That's it.
No, well, I want to thank you very much. We've kept you a bit longer than we were expecting to, because the precautionary exclusion came upon us as well at the same time. But I'm really grateful for the comments you've made. We will now suspend the committee till 4 p.m. when we take our next evidence. So order.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, order. We're resuming the committee now. We've heard from the Shadow Leader of the House, and we're very grateful that we've got both the Leader of the House and the Minister for the Constitution from the Cabinet Office with us today. We will be asking you questions about the scrutiny of Secretaries of State who are in the House of Lords, and if time permits, we may also wish to ask some questions about the proposals for precautionary exclusion. But if we can kick off, perhaps, I don't know if you want to say a couple of words of introduction?
Firstly, just to thank the committee for doing this piece of work. The fact it is being done means that this is it's unusual, although there is a precedent for this. But I think it is important, and the committee will know the Foreign Secretary thinks it's important that scrutiny is optimised. So just thank you for the work, and we'll crack on.
Thank you very much.
I fully support everything the Leader of the House said.
Thank you. So can we start with Sam Dixon?
Thank you. This is the first time in more than 4 decades that a member of the House of Lords has held one of the great offices of state. So what pros and cons does the government see in appointing Lords members to senior cabinet positions?
So look, this is not the first time we've had Lords ministers in Secretary of State roles. I think you can make the case that it creates some difficulties, which is why we're having this procedure committee. I think you can argue that there are some advantages in the year we are about to have of having a very experienced Foreign Secretary in a year of unprecedented geopolitical change with all the elections that are going on around the world. And my personal view, someone that's not facing having to fight an election per se. So I think there are pros and cons to it. Clearly, this is the Prime Minister's appointment, and I'm not cited on his personal deliberations on that. But I think, given the situation, we want to make sure that the Prime Chamber, the Commons, can scrutinise the Foreign Secretary.
I come back. Do you see no distinction between the great offices of state and other Secretaries of State's roles?
So I do, and in preparing for this, I was trying to think of the scenarios that the House particularly would want to hear from the Foreign Secretary. I know you will have heard in previous evidence, obviously, at times of great national crisis, or if we're facing the option of potentially deploying our armed forces, it's often the Prime Minister that leads those statements and debates on the floor of the House. More often than not, it is a junior minister from the FCDO that would be going to answer questions, particularly if they relate to a particular region of the world. But there will be some other things that fall between those two categories. For many things like op pitting, the minister that people most wanted to hear from was the Defence Secretary. I think for Israel and Gaza, that is a good example of when people will, on occasion, want to hear from the Foreign Secretary, even though the Minister for International Development is very able and can probably speak with great authority on most of the issues that Parliament will want to hear about. So I recognise that, and that is why we're keen to help facilitate scrutiny arrangements that the House wants.
No, just to add, I think in the case of Lord Cameron's appointment, there is a very great deal going on in the world at the moment, and having a Foreign Secretary who is famous can only be an asset. That when you think of British Foreign Secretary turning up in foreign capitals around the world, and already having contacts, already being the sort of person that people will counsel meetings to see, I think that's good for British diplomacy. So, but yeah, obviously, as the leader said, we have to be mindful of a Parliament's need to scrutinise his work. But as she's also said, the truth is that at moments of great sort of crisis, it tends to be the Prime Minister that leads on foreign policy issues in the House.
Thank you. Jack Burton.
Thank you, Chair. And obviously we're talking about this now because of the Prime Minister's appointment, but there was consideration that was being given some time ago when we had, with the Labour government, Lord Adonis and others who were appointed, Mandelson, who were appointed from the Lords. So do you think more generally that we need to look at better scrutiny when we do have members of the Cabinet who are appointed from the Lords? Does that process need to be more robust generally? Maybe Leader first.
So I think that in your deliberations you'll be concerned about perhaps setting out some principles. I mean, I very much feel that the Commons is the prime chamber, and you may want to set out principles, but I think we also just need to be careful about not setting a precedent that might work in this instance but not necessarily be ideal in future. And I think it's a great merit of how we do things in this place that we are pragmatic and we are practical and we look at each individual case. So I think it is good that these things evolve. Your deliberations will be built on what's happened previously. There may be things that have previously happened that you wouldn't want to see, for example. So I know under the last Labour government, there was a precedent set for statements being given in the Lords first. I think it's a good thing that statements are given in the Commons first where that is possible. So I think I would just urge you to be pragmatic, as you always are.
Minister, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of the robustness of scrutiny when we do have these sort of eventualities?
I think it's important to consider precedent when looking over these questions, in that it's well within established precedent for the Commons to invite members of the Lords or indeed anyone to come and give evidence in various forums. And recent years that tends to be select committees, but if you go back into the 19th century, it was far more common for people who weren't members of the House of Commons or indeed weren't members of the House of Commons to be invited to give evidence. It was also the case that from time to time members of the House of Lords appeared to give evidence in front of the Commons. So that you do have, the Commons does have the power to request that scrutiny if it wants to, and it can choose the means by which it does it. And if you look at the early 19th century, it certainly wasn't unusual for the Commons to find ways to take evidence from the Lords. And it also was the case that from time to time, members of the Lords sought an invitation to come and speak up about something that affected them personally or something that affected the business of government. So I think in terms of, as is often the way in the British Constitution, if you want to find a means of doing something reliably, the answer is normally in the past. If you depend on precedent, then you're less likely to go about things in a way which will create unintended consequences.
Leader, you mentioned about Lord Cameron's willingness to be scrutinised. Could I ask what sort of discussions have been had with Lord Cameron about what his views are on the level of scrutiny he'd be prepared to accept?
So I have spoken informally to him about this, and immediately after his appointment, and he has been very proactive and forward-leaning. I think he is keen to accommodate what the Commons' optimal solution is, and I think he recognises the importance of that. I think he also appreciates that actually it's helpful to him as a Foreign Secretary to to be seen to be having that level of scrutiny, but also foreign secretaries are very busy people, and having time with colleagues and understanding where they're coming from, understanding what their constituents' concerns are, is very important. So I think he will be guided by what you say.
Yes, did you have anything further to add to that?
No, I'm sure that that's correct.
Thank you. If I could just come back, I'm very curious on the point about historical precedents, because when we have received advice on this, we've heard about the Duke of Wellington and the famous address to the Duke of Wellington. But perhaps is it possible? You've clearly done some research into this. Are there any other examples you could cite of the way that that scrutiny was done in historical precedent terms? We know with the Duke of Wellington, it was, I think, a chair was brought to the bar of the House and comments were made by the Commons towards the Duke, but
yes.
What else has happened?
Well, I think if I remember right, that was in 1814, and it was after the Peninsular War, and the Duke of Wellington asked to come to the House to give an account of, to thank the House for its support and give an account of what had happened in Spain. But there were instances in, I think it was about 1805, Lord Melville had been impeached by the Commons, and he asked to come and sort of clear his name. He asked to come and give evidence. There was also an instance around about the same time, and someone will have to check all of these references for me, I'm afraid, where Lord Tynemouth, who was involved in the East India Company, was asked, was ordered to come to the House, and there was a bit of a set-to between the Lords and the Commons about whether this was proper, and the Lords said that it wasn't. The Lords said that the Commons had no right to order a member of the Lords to come and give evidence. So the Commons then invited him, and he came, and he gave evidence in 1806 and in, I'll say 1814. And that was to, I think, that was to discuss affairs in India. So he wasn't a government minister. I don't know of any cases of government ministers and the Lords being asked to come to the chamber, but there was certainly, and there were other instances where there are plenty of other instances where people who were not members of the Commons were asked to come and give evidence to, I guess, what we would now call committees of the whole House. There was an inquiry in 1821 into the John Bull newspaper, which was a scurrilous tabloid, and there was also an inquiry at some point in the early 19th century into the Grand Old Duke of York, who had a mistress who was using her proximity to the Duke to take bribes from soldiers to get commissions. So this was just the way that the House used to do business.
Thank you. Patrick, did you want to come in on that point?
Well, yes, just to pick up on a couple of things that the leader said, if that's okay, because you said that you would expect that statements would continue to be made in the Commons first, but Lord True has said, the leader of the Lords, that he anticipates that when statements are of sufficient import to be made by the Foreign Secretary, they will be made in the Lords first, and then repeated in the Commons. What's your reaction to that, both in principle and in practice, in terms of the effect it will have on the...
So there will undoubtedly be occasions, you can imagine, where, because of sitting times, or there is something of urgency that needs to be got on record, where that might happen. But what has happened under this Foreign Secretary is that statements have been made in the Commons first. And I think that is a principle I think is important. And then they have been repeated by a junior FCDO minister in the Lords. I think that is an important point. Undoubtedly, there may arise a scenario, in part because sitting hours are different, where you do think it is the best course of action to make a statement in the Lords first by the Foreign Secretary. But I think that for matters of, as we've already said, of particular importance, or whether they are following up from a particular international event, quite often it is another minister, Prime Minister or Secretary of State level that makes those statements in the Commons. I certainly, as leader of the Commons, would want the Commons, where possible, to be informed first. I do think that is an important principle.
Of course, in the olden days when the Prime Minister was a member of the House of Lords, the leader of the House answered for the Prime Minister in the Commons. So who knows whether that scenario might re-emerge one day. But
Who's coming up?
the Foreign Secretary, we're after this meeting, I think we'll be able to publish the letter that he sent us that we received this morning. And while there had been this idea that in principle he was happy to abide by, whatever we and the Commons would prefer, what he's said in his letter is that His Majesty's Government is happy to consider other appropriate mechanisms so that Parliament is able to fully scrutinise the work of the FCDO, in full appreciation that any changes will be a matter on which both Houses of Parliament must agree. So that doesn't necessarily suggest that if we were to propose that he comes before a grand committee of the whole House or something like that, that would automatically happen at the discretion of the House of Commons. It suggests that, in fact, there would have to be agreement between both
So
houses.
I think a couple of things. I think that both the Foreign Secretary and the government are keen to accommodate what this committee and ultimately the House wishes. I can't emphasise that enough. There potentially, depending on what you come up with, will be some things that we have to address. For example, you might propose something which requires their lordships to change their standing orders, for example. And in that sense, their lordships have to agree to give the Foreign Secretary leave to come and do something you might want him to do. So there is that situation. As I set out at the start, I think what everyone wants are scrutiny arrangements that enable that powerful connection our constituents have to people in high office via us as members of Parliament to be maintained. I think that is an important point. But I think we are talking about things and scenarios which will not be happening every week. Because more often than not, it is very able, more junior ministers that are doing a perfectly good job and representing the government's position at the dispatch box in the Commons, which does happen week in, week out, or in moments of much greater importance. It is usually someone like the Defence Secretary or the Prime Minister who's at the dispatch box. But there will be scenarios, as I say, I think Israel and Gaza is perhaps one of those scenarios where you will want that direct line of sight with the Foreign Secretary. So I think provided you're proposing something which is not requiring things that are unreasonable or unpractical for the Foreign Secretary to do, then he is more likely to want to accommodate you.
That still sounds as if it relies on sort of goodwill and convention, though, rather than compulsion, because there are only limited circumstances in which either the House or a committee of the House can actually compel someone who is not a member of the House
the leader
to appear before.
The leader is absolutely right that you, unless the Lords were to change their standing orders, there are certain you can't compel a member of the House of Lords to appear before the Commons. And now I think there are two different aspects of this which are sort of become merged over time. The first is that a member of the House of Lords has to seek permission to appear in front of the Commons if they've been accused of something. And that goes back to, those who are interested, goes back to 1674, where the Duke of Buckingham and the Earl of Arlington were both called in front of the Commons. The Duke of Buckingham because of his lascivious lifestyle, and the Earl of Arlington because he liked papists. And after this had happened, the Lords took the view that this was beneath the dignity of the House and that other members of the Lords shouldn't do it. It would set a precedent if there were always being Lords dragged to Lords. So part one, accusations against the individual. Part two is to come and give evidence. And as I was saying, in the early 19th century, it was established that Lords could accept an invitation, if they wanted to, but they didn't have to. So in order to get, if you wanted to get compulsion, you would have to persuade the House of Lords that it was to change its standing orders. But I don't think that's going to be entirely necessary.
What does that tell us then about the primacy of the House of Commons?
So look, I think that I fully understand it's part of your inquiry to anticipate trouble, and you're quite right to raise this, but I don't think these scenarios will be arrived at. If you were to suggest that the Foreign Secretary has to go to the bar of the House every Monday lunchtime to be scrutinised, that is not a reasonable thing to ask him to do because of other things that he has to do, and I don't think it is necessary. You wouldn't expect the Foreign Secretary to have to do that on a weekly basis. I am not, and that is something I might worry about, but I'm not expecting you as a very sensible procedure committee to come up with this. I think you are going to come up with proposals, I hope, that will look at those not hourly scenarios where there is real value to members of this House being able to scrutinise the Foreign Secretary directly. I'm not anticipating this having to happen every single week, and we will look to accommodate what you propose. Previous suggestions that you have made have been very sensible and welcome. Where we think we can add value, we do, but we deliver on them. And I've no reason to believe that this won't continue.
Thank you, Chair.
Nigel Mills.
I mean, most departments answer on a rota once every month or so. I mean, you're ruling out weekly. Are you ruling out monthly as well?
Well, I'm not ruling out anything. It's for you to decide what you wish to do. But I'm just saying that this committee has always made very sensible recommendations. I think you're not going to do something which is either open to abuse or would constrain the Foreign Secretary in doing his other tasks. I think that the rota of questions is very helpful. It helps members prepare for them. I can see you wanting, maybe something on a regular format, as well as being able to call on the Foreign Secretary if there is something of particular note you want them to respond to. The government decides who it fields for statements, UQs, those sorts of things. I think it is quite a short list of scenarios that I could envisage where only the Foreign Secretary would do. And as I say, I think you're more likely on those sorts of occasions to get either someone in a senior office, such as the Defence Secretary, or the Prime Minister themselves in those scenarios. But I'm not ruling out anything. It's for you to decide what you think is in the interests of this House.
If we try to put in place a regular appearance, we at least know what we're trying to achieve and what the process is and what the timing is. If we kind of have a nebulous theory that if something is sufficiently urgent that it needs somebody serious but not so urgent that it needs the Prime Minister, then maybe the government will make something happen that we haven't done for 200 years, or maybe it won't. I mean, that's going to take us nowhere. I mean, assuming at some point we need to have a plan for what sort of situation the Foreign Secretary would appear before the Commons and how we go about doing it, rather than having a panic one Tuesday when we actually still don't know how to do it.
But that's what you're doing, and
with, haven't you? Because you've just said, well, if it's really serious, if it's the Prime Minister, it could be the Defence Secretary, so it'll be extremely rare.
Well, I'm not telling the committee how to approach this, but I'd approach it pragmatically by looking at the scenarios when there is value for members to be able to question the Foreign Secretary directly. And you, given the evidence you're receiving, the demand might be, actually, we want to be able to do this on a regular basis. other evidence you might receive might say, actually, it's only in, we only would really want the ability to do this if there was some particular issue that we felt was important. I am not ruling out anything. It's up to you to decide. In approaching this, I have just tried to think of the scenarios where, certainly as a constituency MP, I would want to be able to talk to the Foreign Secretary directly on the floor of the Commons.
The government doesn't have a view. There's not a proposal that you think would be the right one.
No, we stand ready to accommodate your proposals. I'm a leader of the Commons. I'm the government's representative in Parliament. I'm Parliament's representative in government. Scrutiny is important. You've got a tricky job, and Alex and I will assist in telling you what the implications of various things are. But it's the House that needs to decide what it needs.
And it's not unusual, obviously, for Lords ministers to appear before select committees, and I think we understand that Lord Cameron is more than willing to appear before the relevant Commons committees. It's just his strike rate's currently 0 for 2, isn't it? I think he's agreed to appear twice, and neither's another.
I think, in fairness to him, one committee cancelled on him, and in the other scenario, he's attending a funeral. But he, I think, is aware that is that he's embarrassed by that situation. But I think it's not. In both cases, it's unfortunate that it's happened. It's very understandable, and it's not something that he has been deficient in performing his duties.
How regularly is he willing to appear before those committees? Is it just purely a matter for when they ask, or is there a kind of capacity here?
I think it's the same as any select committee. There's usually a negotiation between clerks. I think there's an expectation that the senior minister in a department appears on a regular basis throughout the year, and I know that he would want to do that.
Always been straightforward to convince foreign secretaries that their job is to appear before that committee, but Lord Cameron's a big fan of development, so you think he'll be keen to appear
He is. I think he's already got a date booked in for that committee, so he is appearing before that committee.
No one's told members of that committee. So
Minister, do you want to add anything?
No, look, I think all Secretaries of State are keen to cooperate with select committees, and I think select committees, by and large, are keen to make sure that their requests are not too burdensome, and the relationship is ordinarily very effective. So no reason to think it won't be in this circumstance.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Leader, Minister. I'd like to press a little bit further, although accepting the Leader has said it isn't her place to suggest things, but I am trying to iron out in terms of our lines of inquiry how realistic certain options are in terms of scrutiny for Lord Cameron. So the Minister has talked about quite a lot about being called to the bar or to give evidence in the Duke of Wellington or the various peers over the years about to come and defend their honour. And I suppose my query is that being asked or summoned to the bar, which technically can't be done from the Lords, is it's often to try and tackle wrongdoing on behalf of the peer, which I don't think anyone is suggesting Lord Cameron has done that. He's been appointed by the Prime Minister. Legitimately, we can debate the politics of from Lord Carrington or Mandelson or anybody else on serving in the Lords as a senior Secretary of State. But how realistic is it, in your view, that the Secretary of State should be called to the bar or to the dispatch box and ask questions in the Chamber of the Commons as a non-member of the Commons? Or is it more realistic that our line of inquiry is around Westminster Hall once every 3 months with the 40-something seats that are in there that is done by ballot in order for the Foreign Secretary to gain an understanding of constituents' views? Because I do agree that a lot of what I think members' concerns are about in the elected chamber is just that. We are elected, therefore our postbags are full of complaints on various issues around foreign policy. There's just been a UQ now on an issue in Hong Kong, which had 17 members standing asking questions. It could be a personal interest, but it also could be constituents' interests. and you're a long-serving member of Parliament, so you will totally understand the pressures on backbenchers to pose questions. You answer questions every week. So I'm just curious where if you can, and if you don't want to, I respect that, but there are certain things that I'd assume you as leader and as a member of the House would find unpalatable, like speaking with the dispatch box, I would assume, because Lord Cameron is no longer elected, and then the bar feels like, how would that work? I've read the Duke of Wellington example, so I'm curious about the Minister's examples from 1806 and others. But the reality is, in those scenarios, the Duke and various peers didn't answer questions at the bar. They sat and listened, all recanted situations. Yeah. I don't think anybody on any side of the House thinks that's an effective way of scrutiny.
Yeah. So I have a great deal of sympathy with what you have outlined, and both in terms of the sort of the optics and the precedent it would set for a Lord's Minister to be speaking from the Commons dispatch box. But I also think we need to be very pragmatic about how this might work. In those scenarios where you'd want to hear from the Foreign Secretary and completely endorse what you say about that ability for us representing our constituents to eyeball the minister who leads that department, I think those scenarios you'd have quite a number of people wishing to do that. Westminster Hall may not be ideal to accommodate those people. I've heard also just concerns about it being less secure than other parts of the palace. But something like Committee Room 14 might practically be helpful. And I think that this committee has taken a sort of cautious approach to things. You've piloted things. You might want to review how things are working, take feedback from members on whatever proposal is implemented going forward. But I just think we just need to be guided by the practicality of it. Ultimately, most cases that we're going to be wanting to do this in, people are going to be wanting to either demonstrate that they have told the Foreign Secretary the views of their constituents or raised a particular case, or they're going to be wanting to hear directly from him about a particular policy issue. And we just need to make sure whatever we put in place practically facilitates members being able to do that.
Minister?
Yeah, or to your point about people being admonished at the bar, and obviously that's what the bar is most famous for, and Indeed. What it was last used for in 1957 with the journalist Mr. Juno. But there, as I said earlier, there were instances in the 19th century of people answering questions from the bar, members of the public, occasionally members of the House of Lords. And I think, but as I also said right at the start, I can tell you about precedent, and for you to decide whether you want to recommend we follow precedent or we try something new. And but certainly I'm not aware of any precedent at all of non-members, strangers being able to sit on the green benches or to use the dispatch box. That would really be something very different. And I think something that I'm sure the committee will want to consider is that this, whilst there are something like this has happened in the past, it would feel very new in the modern age, and in doing so, it may have unintended. Secretaries of State in the Lords started to come to the Commons to give evidence. That would probably lead over time to more Secretaries of State being in the Lords. It might, over time, lead to Prime Ministers being in the Lords, and that is, that's it's not inevitable, but it is something which the committee might wish to bear in mind.
But of course, it used to be quite frequent and often. The members of the other place were
absolutely, yeah.
Succeeding each other as Prime Minister from their
right.
respective parties. Two follow-ups, if I may. Just, Leader, in relation to Committee Room 14, I suppose the obvious answer, and I hope the Minister and the Leader know I'm a Welsh MP, if not by accent, if by nothing else, that obviously we have the Welsh Grand that is resurrected as and when enough Welsh members complain about it and ask for it, and where we have a day of debating Welsh issues. So I suppose the question is, do you see that as a possible option where we would have a Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Affairs Grand Committee where 100 plus members could be in Committee Room 14, and that could be held, I don't know how often, but for the Foreign Secretary to be present. And then completely separate in relation to legislation. As the Minister mentioned, that Prime Ministers, other Secretaries of State, the risk of this scrutiny perhaps is opening up more roles for the Lords in terms of Secretary of State. The Foreign Office historically has very limited amounts of legislation brought to the floor. But, for example, hypothetically, of course, if the Prime Minister had decided to make the Home Secretary from the Lords, there has been just in the last 2 months, depending on which side of the chamber you're on, either very welcome or very controversial legislation, which I know could be led from the Lords and as a scrutiny chamber. That's quite right and proper. But would it not be odd, question mark, to have legislative-heavy departments with Secretaries of State serving from the Lords without any scrutiny function for members of the Commons? Now, I accept transport and business in my party, Foreign Office, and going back into the 50s and 60s, even more Lords Ministers from the Macmillan government and the Attlee government, but it is 2023, not 82 or 64 or whatever. So I'm just curious about where you think the line is around. There was a suggestion earlier in live session that the Prime Minister couldn't be from the Lords. That isn't the case. They can be. So I'm just interested in your opinions around the appropriateness of this, without any criticism of their Lordship's House at all. I'm a small C Conservative in this regard, but I do think the lower house is the scrutiny chamber, it's the elected chamber, and I'm just curious about both your views on where the line is on Secretaries of State.
So just with regard to a Grand Committee and Committee Room 14, I think that is definitely worth looking at, and I think has merits over some of the practical issues with Westminster Hall. Very sympathetic to that. I think with regard to legislation, this is, to me, less of an issue than some of the sort of immediate, more real-time events, crises, which clearly the Foreign Office have to do a lot of. And that is because we tend to have a bill minister, and they tend to lead on presenting and taking through the legislation. I mean, I think particularly on, you mentioned Home Office legislation, the bulk of the heavy lifting on that has been done by the middle-ranking ministers. I think even on occasion they've introduced it themselves as opposed to the Home Secretary. And I think in this particular case, as you acknowledge, the Foreign Office does not have a large ledge programme, and certainly in this session that wouldn't be an issue.
And I look, as a junior minister who's done that heavy lifting on a couple of bills in the past couple of years, I concur with what the leader said. I don't think I'm not sure in terms of legislation it matters so much. But certainly one would still, during the passage of a bill, if there was a Secretary of State in the Lords, one would probably expect to hear from the Secretary of State in the Lords at some juncture, whereas we know the level of scrutiny is very high. So I wouldn't really see there was a problem in parliamentary terms there.
Thank you. Just some sort of wrap-up questions on this issue. So, first question, if we were to look at the Grand Committee Room 14 type option, where would you envisage the Secretary of State actually being positioned in the room?
So I have no strong views on this at all. I think providing him with a chair on occasion and a glass of water would meet his requirements.
Thank you. And there's no constitutional, sort of historical precedence on that?
Not that I am aware of, but I imagine that there is a precedent for a glass of water in a chair.
I'm sure that's true. So just some practical examples of where we've been talking about this for the last few weeks, where you would expect a foreign secretary to appear. So if we were to take, the Prime Minister decided we were to take military action and there was to be a debate in the House of Commons on that, we would expect the Prime Minister to open that debate. That's what would normally have happened. But the precedent would be that the Foreign Secretary would wind up that debate. And certainly we were just thinking back about Syria and other times, famous speeches that have been delivered by shadow Secretaries of State or Secretaries of State in the wind-up that have perhaps changed the mood of the House. In that scenario, and again, I know you can't absolutely commit to anything here, but are you imagining that would be more likely to be the Defence Secretary now rather than the Minister of State in the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office?
No, I think it depends on the issue. I mean, issues of importance, whether they're about domestic security or deploying our armed forces overseas, would normally be led by the Prime Minister. Issues of immense significance. I think if it were a case of deploying our armed forces, you would probably have, it would probably be appropriate and more than adequate to have the Secretary of State for Defence or potentially the Deputy Prime Minister on issues that would, say, a terrorist threat or response to that kind of scenario, Home Secretary, in the circumstances that we have at the moment. So I think it is, again, it is just stating as fact, it's government's decision who it fields on those arrangements. But judging by what's happened in the past, it has been those people and that calibre of person. And I would think in the Commons, having another senior Secretary of State, whether they're cyber or national security or armed forces, that I think the Commons would find that acceptable. And I think it is more issues where there's perhaps a protracted crisis, policy response is shifting. It's those sorts of things where people would really want contact with the Foreign Secretary directly.
Yeah, Minister, do you?
No, I think that's right, and it's harder to imagine somebody who was not a member of the Commons summing up a debate rather than simply answering questions.
Yeah, and then you talked about sort of very changing situation. I recall very vividly a statement made by the Foreign Secretary just as we were entering the COVID period when it was still coronavirus and we were still all crammed into the House of Commons at that point. It was before social distancing was even a thing. But it was a very, very good statement in that lots of us had constituents around the world who were struggling to contact relatives or relatives who were stranded. And it was a very long statement. I raised a constituent concern. That constituent's concerns were responded to very quickly by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and the constituent's son was able to get home from South America in that case. But that was going on across the whole House. And I just wonder whether you have any views as to whether it would be acceptable at that point for the Minister of State, admittedly a Minister of State who attends Cabinet, but a Minister of State who doesn't have the full policy brief within their portfolio to be responsible for those kind of statements.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things here. And actually I can give you a current example because there are clearly issues that affect regarding policy, the government's stance on particular issues, wanting to hear what has happened in the background or in bilateral discussions with other nations and third parties. That's the sort of thing that would normally take place on the floor of the House. With regard to casework and other pressing issues that we saw during Op Pitting, but more recently with regard to the situation in Israel and Gaza, the Foreign Secretary is clearly available to members of Parliament. What we're talking about here is what goes on in the chamber potentially or some other pseudo chamber for MPs to hold to account and question the Foreign Secretary. So the Foreign Secretary has listened to colleagues, he has met with colleagues, he has been in contact with members' offices, I know some on the Procedure Committee. He has met with the families of those held hostage. He has taken a great deal of time, rightly so, where his attention was needed. And he did that in the early stages of this job because he was asked to by members of this House and by me in my duties to this House. So what we're not talking about here, and what is not an issue, I hope, is the Foreign Secretary spending time with members of Parliament in meetings, discussing things that are of concern to them. We're talking about a very specific public moment where he's being held to account by members of the Commons. So, I mean, if there are any complaints on any of the other fronts, hopefully I will hear about it, if not in business questions elsewhere. And I already, in his short tenure in office, have had many conversations with him, with also his officials and from the Home Office as well, about ensuring that access and that ability to find out what's going on and raise that casework type issue is in the best place possible.
Thank you. And I mean, you know, potentially there's a vote this evening at the United Nations. There's concerns around policy changes that may or may not be the case. And there are, members are concerned as to how scrutiny can properly be held, how we can properly scrutinise the Secretary of State in this case on the very important matter. It's a policy issue, so we won't go into it now, but I'm just raising the point that this is a live example of where members are concerned about whether there's public scrutiny in the House of Commons on behalf of their constituents of the government's position on those matters. If I can just finish off the constitutional risks, Minister. So you've referred to the risk of if we make this too easy, and it's so wonderful for members of the House of Lords to be scrutinised that we may end up with all our ministers in the House of Lords. I think legally there's limits, aren't there, on the number that could be in the House of Lords, but clearly any government can change that if they wish to. But are there any other constitutional risks that you would like to highlight?
Those are the only ones that have crossed my mind. But as I said earlier on, when you step outside a precedent, you run the risk of unintended consequences. One of the reasons why our system refers back to what has happened before, in order to minimise that risk. And but as the committee will understand, there are a range of possibilities raised by precedent. So I think that as the leader has already made very clear, the Foreign Secretary is extremely open to scrutiny and open to working with members of both houses to make sure that all members of Parliament, members of the Lords, feel that their concerns are being addressed.
Thank you. Leader, I don't know if you've anything, our Minister, either of you have anything you'd like to say that has not been said already, or anything in summary?
No, just thank you for, I know it is a knotty problem to solve, but it's an important one, and we look forward to hearing your recommendations.
Thank you, and we look forward to you being able to include a motion on the order paper and a debate that allows us to do so. Before you go, Leader, if we could just touch on the issue of precautionary exclusion. We've obviously received the letter from the Speaker about the Commission's recommendations, and we've had a brief discussion on the committee's view on that, but I think we will want to look at this in more depth. But I would just wonder if you could perhaps give us your view as to how the Commission has arrived at the recommendations that we see before us now. Any insight you can give us just to explain why the Commissioner has decided on the course it has.
On the broad proposals or the issue of proxy?
I think broadly, and then we'll come on to proxy more. Jack Brereton wants to ask some questions on that.
So just a quick caveat, because I will never tire of saying this. My belief is that the only way we will arrive at what good looks like in a modern workplace, and that we have the right standards of behaviour and we have the right support for anyone who works on or with the estate, is if we recognise that we are not one organisation, we're just shy of 700 organisations, and so the only way you arrive at what good looks like is that you have a very clear vision about what our duty of care is to one another, our staff, each other as members, and what behaviours we should expect from people and our responsibilities. Because we don't have that framework now, we are always going to be looking at things through a silo of a narrow piece of policy, which often doesn't make reference to what else is going on, other organisations, other parts of the parliamentary system and estate. So we end up in sort of ever-decreasing policy circles and ever knottier problems. And I think this is a key example of that. When this was last debated on the floor of the House, there were some key challenges put back to the Commission. One was about the individual's right of reply and their human rights. One was about a debate about arrest or charge, and the approach from the Commission had been about risk as opposed to a particular default on arrest or charge. And the other issue was that this is a very narrow proposal that just looks at members of Parliament. Where the bulk of the issue is, the bulk of the problem, is actually not with members of Parliament, it's with staff. And House staff obviously are looked after by the House authorities, but members of Parliament's own staff. So, and that was another complaint from our colleagues, because it's what actually the bulk of people who work on the estate worry about. So the proposal that's coming back has kicked those ideas and those that pushback around, and has come forward with some slightly revised proposals, largely driven by the practicalities of implementing this. It is a situation that I think will be used in a tiny number of circumstances. It is hard to envisage a situation where the police wouldn't apply bail conditions to someone they thought was a real safeguarding problem, and it was left to this panel to put those, to rectify that situation in terms of who worked on the estate or in a particular part of the estate, offices and so forth that weren't directly associated with it. So it is, for the amount of times it has taken the Commission, it is a very narrow proposal, but I think is seen as a foothold to try and address some of the other issues, and has started to do that. So I know on the staff side, that is now being thought about in the wake of particular cases. It throws up questions, how this scenario will work with other routes that alleged victims would have, such as the ICGS, or through the party system route. So it throws up probably more questions than it actually answers, but it is important that these things have been thought of. I'm sure that members now will want to look at the proposals. My door is always open, and I know that there still remain some concerns around arrest. The Commission couldn't do anything before arrest because in practical terms that is the only point where the police would be able to give information to the House. But we know that there are vexatious allegations made against members, and I think there remains, particularly amongst right honourable and honourable members from the legal profession, that they still think charge is a more appropriate point for the House to be looking at these things. all of us on the Commission are still listening. We want the House to have something that it feels it has confidence in. My door is always open. I know other commissioners would say the same. And that is where we're at. The one particular issue we wanted your committee to be aware of is we very much wanted this to be viewed as to how it would work in practice with what goes on in whips offices. If someone has been accused of something, quite often it is in everyone's interest that that person is not on the estate. And so where someone volunteers to do that, perhaps to the detriment of themselves, but to reassure other people, that they should be able to enjoy the ability to vote. If somebody who, for example, had bail conditions applied to them and was either off the estate or the panel had required to be off the estate, had access to a vote via a proxy vote. And we've just felt that was an anomaly that needed to be addressed. I feel very strongly that if someone has volunteered for the benefit of the parliamentary community to be off the estate and not present, that they should not be, they should not suffer for that, rather than having to go before the panel, which may well then award them a proxy vote. So that's the anomaly we wanted the committee to look at.
Thank you. And Jack Brereton's got specific questions on proxy votes.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of proxy voting, obviously, previously it's only been extended to those on paternity, maternity leave, and we've extended it to those who are seriously ill, and there was quite a lot of reluctance to do so. So why is it appropriate that it should now be extended to those who potentially have committed a very serious offence?
Because you are innocent until proved guilty, and I think very strongly that members of this House, I mean, why it has taken so long in terms of deliberating these proposals is that we are asked to come to this place on behalf of our constituents. Our constituents expect us to represent their interests and to use the vote that we've given, and if you are going to prevent someone from doing that, the reason needs to be sound. It was clearly, although we've obviously deliberated for a time and we've had proxies and it's taken a great deal of thought and care, rightly so, we have given the ability for people who are seriously ill to be able to exercise their vote whilst not being able to be on the estate because of ill health. That, to me, is the right thing to do. And I think if we are going to ask people, either voluntarily or compel them, not to be on the estate when they could be potentially have done nothing wrong, then that I think is, in my view, is not right. Clearly there will be moments when having a vote is not appropriate, but I think on the current proposals that have been put forward by the Commission, and certainly the view of many learned colleagues, is that being arrested for something, that person's innocence must be assumed until that person is proven guilty. And I know that the police may impose bail conditions, or the panel may decide that there is a safeguarding issue to somebody, but I do think that if you have one scenario where you're allowing somebody to have a vote, i.e. the police have put bail conditions on them, whereas you have somebody that may not have the police putting any conditions on them at all, but has volunteered to not be on the estate, that is an anomaly which makes no sense.
There's concerns about, though, grouping those who are on paternity, maternity leave, those who are seriously ill, with those who are potentially very serious offenders, and that they may face all sorts of questions just because they're going on paternity leave, because they now publicly and very clearly have got a proxy. So shouldn't there surely be a way to distinguish between those who are on a proxy for reasons of paternity, maternity, serious illness, from those who are under investigation for very serious offences?
So I think that is a slightly different question, and I can fully appreciate that somebody who is off the estate because of ill health may not wish to disclose the details of what illness they're suffering from. But I think that is about distinguishing one set of individuals from another, and there will be things that you could do potentially that would address that point. I think, though, it is important that if you are asking somebody in one set of circumstances where the police say have imposed bail conditions on them because they view them to be potentially a safeguarding issue, or that their alleged victim is on the estate and shouldn't have to endure their presence, they might be allowed a vote, and somebody who had volunteered to go until things had been resolved was not able to vote. That doesn't sit well. Again, your committee has all kinds of knotty problems to solve, and we rely on you to think them through and solve them. But I think that it is an important point of principle that unless there is a very good reason, we facilitate members of Parliament being able to exercise their vote on behalf of those that sent us here.
Chris Elmore.
Thank you. I asked this question of the shadow leader, so it's not aimed at anybody, and I appreciate also that you're just two members of the Commission and it's a broader body looking at a really complicated issue. So I don't make any light of any of the work that the Commission has done. And obviously we've held our own responses to Mr Speaker and to the Commission over the last year, or however long it's been since you've been looking at this work. The argument around safeguarding, I'm just curious what the Commission's next step is in relation to constituency offices. Because members of Parliament are sort of governed, which is a loose term, around some very archaic laws that give us privilege, which is a privilege and should be allowed to continue, because we can say what we wish on behalf of supporting our constituents without legal recourse. You know that. But if it was in any other profession where the police had charged somebody that had a licence to practice, or a doctor or a solicitor or was a teacher, then they wouldn't necessarily be in a position where they would have access to vulnerable constituents or to go into schools, or and completely agreeing that if someone has voluntarily agreed to not be on the estate for a safeguarding reason, because a victim should be allowed to go around and carry on with their work, for example, I'm just wondering if it's spun on its head that there are thousands of people who work on the estate, but also as MPs we have access to thousands of constituents. And if the police don't necessarily set bail conditions, but it could be from a constituent, how do we deal with that scenario where it is publicly available that they have a proxy because they've been asked to not be on the estate for safeguarding, but yet continue about their constituency business?
Mm-hmm. So this is, I will bring you back to what I said at the outset. We are never going to arrive at what good looks like, or that makes remote sense to anyone in a normal place of work, which is one organisation, unless we start addressing these problems together with other organisations. We are talking about, in some cases, a set of circumstances which are vanishingly small but might crop up. The Speakers' Conference has done a good job of looking at the relationship between members of Parliament and their staff and thinking all of that through. But we should be looking at these things in the round, and it's not just about behaviours, it's also about security. How we are, going to arrive at excellent security and ensuring people aren't infiltrating this place unless we've got Cabinet Office, political parties and the House authorities working together, which is now starting to happen on a tighter basis. We're not going to arrive at what the best looks like. So that's my view. I will continue to say it to every committee I appear before.
Thank you. Nigel Mills.
Could you see a scenario, Leader, where you would want to be one of the panel of 3 who determined an exclusion or otherwise?
So if the House voted for this, and it is not the proposal that I would be, but I would, if my name were on that, and the House wished that process to be stood up, I would discharge those duties. I think that my thinking, if I were to do that, would be completely focused on risk. I think there is always a danger when you set up a body that people automatically feel they have to err on the side of caution, as it were, and you know, if they've been set up that they would reach a conclusion that individual should not be on the estate. And I think that this proposal only has merit if it is a genuine risk-based approach that looks at credible information from the police, looks at what conditions they have set, looks at whether someone has volunteered to leave the estate themselves, and reaches those conclusions. One of the issues which was debated on the floor of the House is that members of Parliament felt that this should be led by their peers, not sort of HR people or that sort of thing.
That same view, but I mean, I suppose the reason for asking is having a panel where it's one of the MPs on the commission kind of like leaves it up to 6 people, one of whom sits in the cabinet, one of whom sits in the shadow cabinet, another one is a government appointment, another one's an SNP appointment, and then 2 are chairs of committees appointed, one by the government and one by the shadow leader of the opposition, basically. I mean, it's not a brilliantly accountable or impartial process if we're not careful, is it?
So I think that I mean that's something people can feed back on, and certainly the original setup of the panel has evolved based on what members of Parliament have suggested. I mean, it's not the case that I would be sitting on that.
Or one of the only 6 that comes.
Well, I think it would not. Everyone else would have had to if something unpleasant happened to them for that scenario to arise. But of course, we all have. I mean, I would say that.
Leader as well. I mean.
Well, I would say that this again comes back to my point. All of us have all kinds of personal interests and things that we want to happen in our parliamentary career, things that we either want to do, or office or jobs or committees we would all like to sit on. But none of those personal and private concerns should trump our obligations to one another and the place we're fortunate to sit in. And I think in all we do, we can try and strengthen that, and we can try and make people aware of those obligations and support and call out situations where people are being intimidated into doing the wrong thing, should that scenario arrive. But if we can't rely on each other, though, you know, we all write the rule book, we all police ourselves, then, you know, we're all doomed, quite frankly. And I do think that the vast majority of people who are given responsibilities, sitting in judgment, for want of a better expression, on colleagues, know what their duties are, and they exercise them with the responsibility matching the authority that they've been given.
Why the commission chose the panel member to be one of the commission and not one of the liaison committee, who would at least be committee chairs elected by the House, or I mean, there's various other ways to find a senior MP that's not connected to the government, and all or the opposition that might feel a little...
So I think that is a legitimate question. I think in part these proposals are arrived at with regard to trying to keep confidentiality and you know those sorts of concerns, but that's a legitimate piece of feedback, just as the charge point is a legitimate piece of feedback. As I say, the Commission has arrived at this proposal, but I know we're all still in listening mode. So if you think it can be improved, or you think it would have greater confidence for the House to have that different panel makeup, please do let us know.
Thank you very much, Leader and Minister. We, I know, have tested you on many points here, so we very much appreciate it. Can I ask members of the committee if we could stay behind for a few minutes for a private discussion? But thank you. That's the last piece of evidence we're taking, and we will look to report back to the House in the new year on the matter of Secretaries of State in the House of Lords and their accountability to the House of Commons. Thank you. Order, order. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.